She sent me with those fellow clerks. She made me work with them for about an hour, and then the widow read to me. I couldn't have stood it much longer. Miss Watson was always saying, "Huckleberry, Huckleberry, don't put your feet there. Huckleberry, sit up straight. Huckleberry, you ain't trying to behave." And she told me about the bad place I would go if I didn't do right. And I said, I wish I was there right now. She got mad at me then, but I never meant her no harm. She said she was going to live so she could go to that good place. Well, I couldn't see no advantage to going where she was going, so I made up my mind right then. I wouldn't even try for it. I started making plans to escape and to run away. One night I lit a candle and went upstairs, and there was my old pop. He said it was awful for me to put on all those airs around Hannibal, Missouri. And then he took $1 off of me and went downtown and bought himself some whiskey. And he catched me one day and took me down the river across to that little cabin on the Illinois shore on this other side. And I never had a chance to run off. He was meanest when he was drinking, which was most of the time. He come back and said some folks downtown was telling me that there was going to be a trial. They were going to take me away from him and give me to the Widder Watson for my guidance. Pop didn't like that the government might take me away from him. I runned off soon after that, and I hid out on Jackson Island. That's where I met Mrs. Watson's black slave, Nigger Jim. He said he'd runned off too, and I promised I wouldn't tell on him. I knowed I was doing wrong, but I knowed good folks would despise me, and I knowed good folks would despise me and call me a low-down abolitionist, a nigger lover, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to go back there again anyway. Me and Jim, we found a log raft, and we went off down the Mississippi River together. We run at night, and then we laid up in the bushes along the bank in the daytime. We just let that raft float during the night, wherever the current wanted to. It was lovely to sleep on the raft at night on the river. We load on our backs and smoked our pipes looking up at the sky. Not a cloud in it. The sky looks very deep when you lay on your back in the moonshine. I never noticed before that how far a body could hear when you're on the water that night. Every now and then we'd see steamboats slipping by in the dark. And every now and again they'd belch a whole lot of sparks up the chimney. Well, we'd look up and see those stars. I said I thought that these stars had been made. Jim thought they'd always been there. I didn't argue the point with him. His reason seemed to be about as good as mine. I'd go to sleep, and sometimes Jim wouldn't wake me when it was my time to take to the watch. He often done that. I'd wake up about daybreak sometime, and he'd be sitting there with his head in his hand, down between his knees, moaning and groaning. I never took no notice, no let on that I heard him. But I know what he was thinking. He was thinking about his wife and his children way back up the river, way up north. And he was feeling low and lonely. Because you see, he'd never been away from his home before in his whole life. And I reckon he cried just as much for his people as white folks did for their people. It didn't seem quite natural, but I reckon it was so. We kept looking for Pharaoh down where the Ohio River flowed into the Mississippi. We said if we got to Cairo, we would sell that raft, and we'd take a steamboat and go way up the Ohio till we found the Free State. And then we'd be out of trouble. Jim got trembling all over and feverish, being so close to freedom. He said when he got to a free state, he'd go to work and save enough money to buy his wife. He was on that farm owned by Mrs. Watson. And then they'd both work and make enough money to buy their 2 children. Or if they couldn't get enough money to buy them, they'd find an abolitionist to go and steal those children for them. It scared me just to hear such talk. Why, Jim would never have dared to talk like that in his life before. coming right out and flat-footing, saying he would steal his children. Children who was owned by a man I didn't even know. A man that ain't never done me no harm. You see? You see, I couldn't get into my head that his children wasn't free. And who was to blame for that? My conscience got to turning up hotter and hotter. And I decided one day to paddle ashore and to confess to the authorities that there was this escaped slave out there on that raft. And 2 men with guns saw me. They was looking for that runaway slave. They asked me, who's on that raft out there? Is he white or a nigger? I said, he white. So they went off. I knew I'd done wrong. I guess there was no need for a body like me trying to do right. A body that don't get started right just has no choice. Then I says to myself, hold on, Huckleberry, hold on. Had I done right and gave up Jim up, would I feel better than I do now? I know I would feel bad. So what's the use of learning to do right when it's troublesome to do right and it ain't no trouble to do wrong? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I came into this world with Halley's Comet, and I fully expect to leave the next time Halley's Comet comes around. Thank you.